We are watching former President Donald Trump in his first lengthy remarks after being found guilty on 34 counts of document-related charges. This is taking place at Trump Tower. He began his remarks with what could actually be regarded as political remarks about various things that are part of the campaign, from immigration to car imports, but then has turned, of course, into the guilty verdict and his interpretation of the case, in some cases factually incorrect, which we'll get into in just a moment. We were told this was going to be a news conference. We are going to watch and wait and see if he takes questions in the meantime, and we'll continue, of course, to monitor his remarks. In the meantime, let me bring back Laura Jarrett, NBC News senior legal correspondent, Danny Savalos, also here, an NBC News legal analyst. A lot to parse through here, a lot of claims here. Let's pick one.
Let's start with the gag order.
Start with the gag order. He did make comments, obviously referencing Michael Cohen. I think most people would agree that's who he was discussing. Yeah. Michael Cohen still covered, and the former president certainly covered by this.
So the purpose of the gag order, remember, is to protect the witnesses from being attacked so that it doesn't influence their testimony. The purpose of the gag order is to be there in place for the duration of the trial. And when he was fined before for his violations of the gag order, it was for making references about Michael Cohen, similar to the types of things that we heard today. I'm interested to see whether, now that the trial has been completed, his attorneys actually asked for clarification to say, hey, Judge, is he still under the terms of this gag order until sentencing? Because there's an argument, I think, from the defense side to say, now the trial is over, he should be allowed to say whatever he wants. I can see the prosecutors pushing back on that in the event if for any reason they think there's still some witness intimidation. So I think that's an issue. We're going to reach out to the defense on their position. But he seems to be operating under the assumption that he is still under the gag order. He referred to himself as under it.
And we should note he also has repeated several times that he still wanted to testify, talking about the jeopardy that most lawyers will advise you that if you put yourself out there. But again, maintaining that he wanted all along to testify. Another point I think we have to deal with is he repeated the claim that this is all the result of President Biden or the White House, Democratic operatives who've made this happen. This was a state prosecution.
A state case indicted by a state grand jury, and now a grand jury, now a jury of 12 in New York finding him guilty. This was not a decision reached by a judge. This is not a decision reached by prosecutors, certainly. This was a decision reached by a jury with no connection, no discernible connection to the White House or the Justice Department. It's a claim that he's tried to surmount for political reasons throughout this trial.
And Danny, let me ask you, he also went into a very long defense of criticism of the trial and what they wanted and what they didn't get. He said the government got everything it wanted in terms of requests to the judge. Is that a fair characterization?
No, not exactly. I mean, the defense won some points throughout the trial, but one of his main complaints, for example, is that they weren't able to call an election law expert. But even his own attorneys had to know that was going to be a challenge to get that expert on the stand. Because while you can call experts on issues that are beyond the average knowledge of a juror, like blood spatter experts, firearms experts, fingerprints, things like that, something like an issue of law, and Justice Merchan said as much, is an issue that the judge will instruct the jury on. You can't call generally an expert to tell jurors what the law is. That is the province of the judge. And that's why the judge did not preclude that expert. Right. The judge instead limited the scope of testimony of that expert. And Donald Trump just acknowledged as much, saying that there were areas that he would have been able to testify about. They made a strategic decision and decided not to call the expert. But
is all this par for the course in a typical criminal trial?
Absolutely. You don't get to call experts to discern and to try to decipher the law. That's for the judge to do.
Right. You can't call an expert to say and qualify the expert as he may in fact be an expert and qualified as an expert, but you can't turn to him and then say, tell the jury what the law is and tell the jury that what the defendant did was in fact lawful. That is literally what the purpose of the jury instructions are. That is why they are instructed. And that's exactly what the judge said. Maybe not verbatim, but essentially I will instruct the jury on the law. Therefore, these are the limited areas that your expert can go into.
He also talked about this case being only a misdemeanor. In fact, it was boosted to a felony, correct?
Boosted to a felony in this case. And we should be clear that the way that they sort of attach their wagon in this case to a felony is novel. We have not seen that before. We have seen plenty of falsification of business records cases in New York and other places. But the way that they went about it, by sort of latching it to a federal violation of campaign laws, that is novel. That is untested, and it hasn't been done before. And it's one of the reasons that he's right that many prosecutors didn't want to bring this case, including prosecutors in this very office in Manhattan. But they ultimately decided that they thought that they could bring it. They thought that it was valid. They thought that it was legal. And he's also right. The prosecutors in the Southern District of New York did not bring this case, but he's wrong about why. The reason they didn't bring it is because he was president at the time. And so they couldn't prosecute a sitting president.
All right, let's bring in some guests who have worked for both the Republicans and Democrat administrations. Hogan Gidley worked for Mr. Trump's White House as former White House Deputy Press Secretary, and Simone Sanders Townsend. She's a former senior member of the Biden-Harris administration and served as chief spokesperson to Vice President Kamala Harris. Appreciate all of you joining us. Hogan, let me begin with you. What we have seen so far, is the former president doing himself any favors?
Well, what he's doing is trying to defend himself against what he deems a rigged process. We will see this play out over the course of the next several days and weeks. But we're talking about a town, New York City, in which they've never met a felony. They didn't want to downgrade to a misdemeanor. And in this particular trial, they wanted to make a misdemeanor into a felony. So I understand his rationale and his reasoning there. What it will help with him, though, is something he said, I think right after or right before you cut away, is when he pointed out 34 different counts here. In just 12 hours, he's raised $35 million off of this. Many people in this country deem this as an unfair proceeding. Forget the party, forget your political persuasion. So many people want fairness, and they don't deem this case as having been conducted fairly. That's what Donald Trump's talking about right here. Of course, he's going to talk about issues, as you pointed out, right off the top. But right now, he is trying to explain to the people what he thinks happened in this case and why he's been unfairly targeted. And that's going to be the battle from now until Election Day.
He's not allowed under the gag order to really go or make comments about the jury, but you are. Many others have called this, again, a sham trial. Is that not a direct repudiation of the work of the jury? How do you account for the fact that 9 hours they were able to look through this evidence and make the decision they did?
Well, it's Manhattan, so they don't like him here. That's pretty obvious, and a lot of people will call them a jury of his peers. Okay, I would argue it's a jury of his political opponents because they don't like him. The judge doesn't like him, and quite frankly, when I talk to reporters in the room who lean left, whose names you would know, national reporters at big entities, called me and said it was obvious. The judge didn't like him, and the jury didn't like him either. No one is surprised by this outcome.
Let me bring in Simone Sanders, again, former chief spokesperson for Vice President Harris. Simone, give me your thoughts about, we keep hearing about the weaponization of the judicial system. How will the Biden campaign deal with this going forward in terms of how much they can talk about and how much they want to walk past?
So I think you're going to hear two things. And first, let me back up and say that, prior to my political career, I spent a lot of time doing juvenile justice, criminal justice reform work. And so in that work, there are many people that will criticize a system that is proven to be disproportionately unfair to a number of different individuals, a lot of times Black and brown, young people, young men and women. And I don't think inherently criticism of a system is a degradation of the system. That being said, we all watched and covered, and I know Laura and Danny are sitting there at that table with you, Lester, this trial, and saw how, frankly, the system bent over backwards to ensure that the former president received a fair and impartial trial. Judge Marchand from the bench multiple times noted, I am not going to decide if he's guilty or not. That is up for the jury to do. I think you're going to hear the Biden campaign and Democrats writ large lean into that piece of it, that this was a say this was a trial that went forward. This was not something that the Justice Department, that Biden himself ordered, as people are saying. We all saw this play out, reading it with our eyes, watching it with our own eyes, hearing it with our own ears, and now the jury has spoken, and Donald Trump did not take the stand. I think you're going to hear many of those things from Democrats, and you're going to hear from the Biden campaign, and I think President Biden and the Vice President more specifically, about just tying this into their argument about democracy, and this on top of other issues. It is not enough for the Democrats to just talk about Donald Trump's legal troubles. Lester, there are many people out there that did not realize that even though Donald Trump has now been convicted of 34 felonies, he is still on the ballot. There are none of these court cases that are going to bar him from being able to run for president or, frankly, even be elected president. The only thing that is going to keep Donald Trump from being the next president of the United States is what people do at the ballot box come this fall. And that is something, in my talking to Democrats over the last 24 hours, that we're going to hear them hammer home.
Simone, let me ask you, is this good for Democrats? And when I say is this, not just the verdict, but even the trial, the fact that this case was brought, is it helpful or does it hurt Democrats in the long term?
I would say neither, Lester. It's not about if it's helpful for Democrats or if it's hurtful for Democrats. Frankly, people bring trials and cases happen because do people do crimes or not? And so the question is, did Donald Trump engage in activity that a grand jury found credible to say that he should be charged? And we know that the answer to that question is yes. And then a jury of 12 folks decided that he was guilty of not just one felony count, but 34. So for Democrats, I don't think it benefits them to get into the nitty-gritty of the weeds of the minutia of his trials or not. The point is, Donald Trump has now been convicted of 34 felonies. He can say whatever he wants about those felonies, but the paper does not lie. So our Republicans have to make a decision about what they're going to do about that. And Democrats need to not downplay it, right? Because this is very serious. The United States now joins other Western countries, such as France, such as Italy, as Israel, right, who have charged and gone through trials for the current and former presidents. This is not unusual for the Western world. It is unusual for America. So this shouldn't be downplayed, but this is not going to win them an election in November, and I think Democrats know that.
And Hogan, Mr. Trump continues to make the allegation that this is all being driven by the Biden White House, that he's pulling the strings behind the curtain. Is that something? Is that a narrative that you have adopted, or is it strictly what Mr. Trump is saying?
Well, I would imagine a lot of Republicans are going to adopt this in large part because in the other cases, too, you see a lot of back and forth with the prosecutors going to the White House, having conversations, et cetera.
Right, but we've seen it here.
Yeah, but even in the press conference right after this, Alvin Bragg was flanked by the number 3 person from the DOJ. So it's legitimate for the president to say, wait a minute, does Biden know anything about this? Was there any communication? And some of your other legal panelists were pointing out the fact that the head of the FEC was not allowed to testify. And they made arguments for that, right or wrong. I'm not sure. I'm not an attorney. What I do know, though, is that Michael Cohen was allowed to testify on whether or not Donald Trump broke the law. He was able to assess whether he thought federal election rules were violated. But the defense couldn't mount the same argument. But Simone is right about so much of this because it's not about this case. I think a lot of this has been baked into the final product. It's about the issues that the American people want addressed. The wide open southern border, spiking crime, drugs pouring into their communities, an economy where you can't afford gas and groceries. Those are all laid squarely at the feet of Joe Biden. The American people have been kicked in the teeth by those failed policies now for 4 years. And the Democrats would rightly understand that this latest knock on Donald Trump, this latest attempt to finally get him, is probably going to backfire, and it won't amount to much moving forward in this campaign.
Hogan, thanks very much. We should note, of course, there is no evidence that the Biden administration is behind any of this. Let me turn to Laura. You were shaking your head at one point.
Just briefly, we should just be clear that what Michael Cohen was there to testify about was the alleged conspiracy. As he said, he agreed with the former president to do this. He was not there to opine on the law. He was not there to say that that there was an actual violation of law in his opinion as a lawyer. He was there to say what we did together, what we conspired to do together, broke the law. That was just a small distinction I think we should make. He was not there as a lawyer in that capacity.
Michael Cohen was a fact witness,
yes,
and he would never have been qualified as an expert on election law. And really, he's talking about his awareness of whether or not what he is doing is criminal. That's not the same as describing what is and what is not illegal under the law. It's a totally different area of testimony. Expert testimony versus percipient factual witness testimony. That's what Michael Cohen was. And he's the farthest thing from a legal expert because, of course, he's not even a lawyer anymore. So that's not his role. It was never his role. He was a fact witness.
And, Laura, we heard from Todd Blanche earlier today, kind of giving the outlines of what they might base an appeal on. Did anything he said surprise you?
Well, there's plenty, I think. There's plenty of fertile ground here. As we mentioned, they've raised statute of limitations issues. They've raised issues with the fact that Stormy was allowed to testify at length about an alleged sexual encounter that was salacious, which they say obviously never happened, and the former president again denied it again today. I think that's a ripe ground for an appeal in terms of prejudice. We might also see the fact, again, the way they sort of hooked this misdemeanor to another misdemeanor to make a felony had never been done in the way that they did it in this case, and all of that can be grounds for an appeal. All of that is going to take weeks, if not months, if not more than a year.
We're going to go back to Trump Tower. Hallie Jackson is standing by. Hallie, this was billed as a news conference. It was something a bit less than that. Describe what's just happened.
It was not that. It was a statement. It was a speech, essentially, by former President Trump delivered to members of the media who have assembled here on this historic day. I want to give you some context of the room here. If you heard cheering and clapping, it came from a group of supporters who were inside Trump Tower. Outside, you have another group of Trump supporters who are holding signs. One of them, for example, says Trump or death. But inside here, I couldn't help but think, Lester, as I listened to the former president speak, that in some ways this is what we may have heard to a degree if he had taken the stand and testified in his own behalf. I know you've done some fact checking there back at the studio at 30 Rock, but the former president had the opportunity to do so. He said he would have loved to. Again, he chose not to, but you heard him try to make his case, a case that the jury firmly and clearly rejected with those verdicts, guilty verdicts on those 34 counts here. This was, in some ways, the Donald Trump that I have covered and we have all covered here for many years. It was an airing of the grievances. If this trial in many ways has been a trip down memory lane dating back to 2016 and earlier, this was former President Trump ticking through his issues with, for example, his previous impeachments, his time in office, going after President Biden in a way that we often hear at his campaign rallies, Lester. So more to come here. But the former president did one thing here, Mr. Trump. He cast the stakes of this election, saying that November 5th, Election Day, is going to be the most important day in American history. Lester.
Hallie Jackson, thank you. That concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have much more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now, online at NBCNews.com, and a full wrap-up tonight when I see you back here for Nightly News. Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.